My name is Janice Carter. I live in a quiet Washington, D.C. neighborhood, in a white brick house with a red door that creaks every time I open it, as if complaining about the time it's been oiled. From the outside, it looks ordinary, just another house on a street where men fix their lawnmowers on Saturdays, women walk their dogs, and flags hang on every porch like a reminder of belonging and peace. But inside these walls, I've created my own life, one that none of my family even knows about. Because if I told them, they'd think I'd lost my mind. The heart of this life beats inside an old laptop sitting on a wooden table by the window. It's scratched and dull, the keys are worn smooth in places, the screen trembles when I move it, but to me, it's alive, as if my own energy flows between its wires. I spent nights sitting by the window, the dark glass reflecting the light of the screen and my silhouette, my fingers moving so fast my thoughts couldn't keep up. That laptop was the beginning of my empire. I never planned anything grand, never strategized, never dreamed of millions. I simply wrote code because it gave me something no one else did, a sense of peace and power over chaos. I loved solving problems that others didn't even notice. While my former classmates posted photos of themselves with glasses of wine and neighbors argued over parking spaces, I sat in silence, staring at the screen, creating systems that could protect people from what they themselves didn't understand. It all started with small things. The owner of a small bakery in New York posted a desperate message on a forum. Someone had hacked her payment system, and she didn't know what to do. I couldn't ignore it. In a few hours, I rewrote her code, patched the vulnerabilities, protected the files, and when she wired me $500, her gratitude sounded as if I'd given her back not her business, but her meaning in life. Then I realized I'd accomplished something important. This feeling, knowing that your hands, your mind, your labor could bring order to someone else's chaos, became a new kind of addiction for me. And soon, my next challenge came. A small hospital in Chicago was hit by ransomware, and their IT department was in a panic. I worked with them for a week, barely sleeping, drinking cold coffee and writing code until my fingers ached. When everything was restored, the hospital board insisted on payment. And for the first time, I named a figure that seemed bold to me, $45,000. They transferred the money without argument, and when I saw that transfer, for the first time, I felt the weight of real money, earned without bosses, without an office, without external approval. I paid the bills, bought new equipment, and for the first time allowed myself to consider, what if this wasn't just a part-time job, but a path? A month later, a representative from the Denver city government wrote to me. Their servers had crashed, their utilities had ground to a halt, and alarming headlines were already flashing in the news. I signed a contract, a quiet one, without my name mentioned, issued to a newly created company with a neutral name. I worked around the clock, barely tearing myself away from the screen, until everything ran like clockwork. When the money arrived in the account, $275,000, I stared at the numbers for a long time, until my heart pounded as if I were that 20-year-old again, dreaming of proving to the world that I was capable of more. But I didn't tell anyone. To my family, I remained Janice, the odd daughter who didn't fit anyone's expectations. To my sister, I was the eternal loner with a laptop instead of friends. To the neighbors, I was the woman who always kept her curtains closed. They saw me typing for hours, sitting in an old sweater and drinking coffee from that same chipped mug, and they thought I was wasting my life on trifles. Sometimes I heard their whispers, quiet as a draft in the hallway, and they tickled my back, but I pretended not to notice. After all, only I knew what was happening on the other side of the screen, and how close I was to what had recently seemed impossible. My mother sighed as if she were carrying an unbearable burden on her shoulders, and she repeated the same thing over and over again. Janice, it's time you got a real job, with proper management, regular hours, and insurance, she said, with that special note of anxiety that comes from women of her generation, raised in a world where everything had to be structured and explained. My father, on the other hand, didn't plead. He joked, as if the lightness of his words could mask his disappointment. Oh, dear, if it doesn't work out with your computers, there's always room at the office supply store. Someone has to fix the printers. And every time he said it, I smiled, because in that casual phrase I heard not mockery but fear that he didn't understand me, and that I lived in a world where his experience no longer meant anything. My brother laughed loudly, heartily, when I turned down his offer to join his trading firm. Are you seriously considering staying in your den with that old laptop? He'd say, shaking his head, and I'd simply shrug. knowing he wouldn't see the light in my screen the way I did. My sister would just roll her eyes whenever I'd skip family dinner yet again, justifying it with a quick text. Sorry, project, can't tear myself away. I let them believe what was convenient for them. My silence wasn't weakness. It was armor forged from loneliness and determination. I knew they wouldn't understand, and I didn't have to prove anything until my moment came. Instead of arguing, I focused all my energy on the business I'd been building night after night, step by step, like an engineer constructing a tower in the fog. I created an entire network, trusts, companies, firms that existed only on paper, hidden behind each other like Russian dolls, designed not to deceive, but to protect. I learned to write contracts so that even the most prying eyes couldn't trace the money. I learned how to transfer funds through multiple entities so they would disappear from the radar and continue working for me. And every time I closed a deal, I allowed myself a quiet smile, the one no one saw, because the less my family knew, the safer my world remained. One of my most significant achievements happened in London. I remember that morning. An email arrived at my encrypted address, short, emotionless, but between the lines I could sense the panic. The financial firm was on the brink of disaster, their systems had been hacked, and they needed someone discreet who could fix it all without leaving a trace. I agreed almost immediately. For 6 weeks, I lived between time zones, sleeping 3 hours a night, living on coffee and fatigue. Sometimes I worked from a hotel, sometimes right from the kitchen of my house. When Washington was already asleep and London had barely dawned, we texted each other through the night, short messages like protocol updated or system cleared. When it was all over, £10 million had landed in my account. I remember that moment. The screen flickered, the numbers grew, and the silence in the room became almost sacred. I didn't even tell my family I was flying there, just lied and said I was busy on a local project. To them, I was still Janice, forever immersed in the keys. The money started growing faster than I could have imagined. At first, it was like a trickle, quiet but steady. Then the stream grew stronger, wider, more voluminous, and soon I realized I wasn't just earning money anymore, I was controlling the flow. Contracts came one after another, the sums became incredible, zeros multiplied on the screen, and all this was happening in my modest room behind the red door. I watched the numbers grow, but I didn't let them change me. I still drank coffee from my chipped mug, still listened to the creaking door, still lived in a White House, no different from the neighboring ones. My neighbors thought I was one of them, a quiet woman, world-weary, perhaps a little lonely, and that was perfect. I didn't buy anything extravagant, didn't update my wardrobe, didn't go out to restaurants. After all, it wasn't what was seen from the outside that mattered, but what was happening within these walls, here. In this house, I was no longer just a daughter who had been given up on. I became the architect of a vast, invisible structure that supported entire cities. My code protected hospitals, banks, government agencies, private companies. People relied on my work every day, unaware that their security was being ensured by a woman living on a quiet street with a red door. Sometimes I wondered if my family noticed the changes. Could they detect that I no longer worried about bills, saved every penny for gas, or complained about my old car? But they didn't ask. The old story was enough for them, that I was weird, restless, always at the computer, and I let them keep that image, because I knew that when the truth came out, it wouldn't just surprise them, it would upend everything they thought of me. But for now, I lived quietly. My house knew the truth, these walls heard the click of keys, my laughter when the code finally worked, and the silence as I dove back into the task on which millions depended. My laptop knew the truth, its worn keys were imprinted with the history of an empire built by one woman, alone, at night, and I knew the truth. I was becoming someone they would never have believed I was capable of. It was a quiet spring evening, the kind you only get in Washington. The air smelled of damp earth and cherry blossoms, and outside a soft rain fell, trickling down the glass in thin, silvery streams. I sat at my desk, my laptop humming faintly, like a living thing, tired but docile, and I thought I'd probably finish early and finally allow myself some sleep. But then my inbox chimed with a quick signal, a new request, another email. I usually received dozens of these messages a day, some asking for help, some trying to scam, some simply not understanding what they were getting into. I'd learned to recognize them intuitively, with a glance, almost a breath. But this email was different. The sender's line read, Jonathan Hale, a young congressman I'd already heard of, his website had been hacked, hackers had posted obscene slogans, and all voter donations were being redirected to an unknown destination. There was no panic in his message, only restraint and desperate hope. We need help, urgently. I glanced at the screen, at the clock, at the mug in which my coffee had long since gone cold, and hesitated for just a moment. Politics had never been my thing, too much show, too little substance, but broken systems. They always spoke to me in a language I could understand. I leaned closer to the screen, straightened my fingers, felt the familiar tension in my chest, and began typing. My code flowed smoothly, confidently, like breathing. Within an hour, I had found a hole in their security, blocked access, cleared the database, restored the payment system, and strengthened the firewall so that the previous attackers, when they returned, didn't even realize they'd been kicked out of the game. I did all this with that inner focus when the world ceases to exist, and only you, the machine, and the thin thread of logic between you remain. When it was all over, he wrote me briefly, "How much do I owe you?" I smiled. There was something almost naive in the way he asked, as if everything in life could be measured in money. I answered simply, "Nothing, because I can." A second later, a reply came, a short laugh in an audio message, so quiet that it seemed as if he was laughing not into the microphone but to himself. And then, when I first heard that laugh, I had no idea that one day it would ring out in the White House. From then on, Jonathan wrote to me from time to time, not often, not insistently. He just showed up like a comet with short letters in which he asked for nothing more than a conversation. He was interested in how I think, how I stay calm, how I solve problems when everything around me is crumbling. We talked late into the night, me in my home in Washington, and he racing between cities, greeted by crowds and microphones. Sometimes he asked me about technology, sometimes about habits, and once, unexpectedly, about doubts. I told him that doubts are part of any journey. Some people just hide them, while others use them as fuel. He was silent for a long time, and then said, "Janice, you may not realize it, but you live the way a leader should, quietly, without fuss, with the understanding that what matters most is always within." I laughed it off, but his words stuck in me like a tiny splinter, the kind you don't think about every day but feel when you breathe. While he was chasing votes, I was building my empire. What began with private contracts and one-off orders began to grow, as if the roots of something greater were sprouting underground. I began dreaming of a system that could protect not just one hospital, not just one bank, but thousands of organizations simultaneously. This idea evolved into Haven Portal, a platform capable of providing digital security at the click of a button, simple, fast, and intuitive. I wrote the first version at night, with cold coffee and the hum of the refrigerator in the background, and when the code finally worked, I stared at the screen in disbelief. I launched Haven Portal quietly, without press releases, without grandiose promises. I simply opened the website and set a price affordable for everyone, $49 a month for a small team and $1,900 for a large company. I thought it would appeal to startups, independent entrepreneurs, anyone but the big players, but things turned out differently. A month later, a mid-sized bank from Boston wrote to me, signing a $2 million contract, impressed by how quickly the system had protected their network. I remember sitting in front of the screen, my heart pounding in my chest, as if I were standing at the very beginning of something great. Words spread through the industry like whispers turning into loud conversations: security, reliability, simplicity, 3 words that began to be repeated everywhere. Then someone wrote to me from Texas, a network of private clinics exhausted by constant cyber attacks. For the first time in a long time, I boarded a plane and flew to Austin, not giving my real name, acting under a false one. They thought I was just a consultant. When the contract was signed, $8.5 million for 5 years, I stepped out of the building and for the first time in a long time felt the wind, real, living, saturated with road dust and the smell of heated concrete. When I returned home, to my White House with the red door, I took off my coat, put my laptop on the table, opened a bank account, and simply stared at the numbers. They seemed unreal, but I knew they were real, down to the last cent. That was the moment I realized I'd long since crossed the line where dreams become reality. Then came San Francisco. I'd been found, as often happens in our world, through a chain of chance events, and the offer felt like a temptation. A private group with global connections, promising payment in pounds sterling through their US office. It seemed they simply wanted to see how Haven Portal would hold up under the most aggressive conditions imaginable. I agreed not just for the money, although that was tempting, but also because I wanted to test the system to its limits. These people, without hesitation, transferred $10 million, a sum that was supposed to be the starting point for something big. I just didn't know what that something big would bring. 6 months later, they doubled their investment, and at that moment, I realized Haven Portal was no longer a little secret but something far more significant than I could have imagined. However, the more our platform grew, the more I realized I couldn't handle it alone. While initially it was enough to keep everything under control, analyzing every request, every problem, now, with every new client, with every contract, it became increasingly difficult. I began to think about assembling a team that could share this responsibility with me, to not just support but also develop this project. I looked for people not only based on their technical skills but also on their character, because in our business, there's no place for those who hide their motives. The first to join the team was Maya Brooks, a systems engineer from Boston and someone who, like me, loved solving puzzles, but she did it with such ease that sometimes it seemed she needed neither intelligence nor effort to solve the most complex problems. Then came Elena Rossi, an Italian-American security analyst whose eyes could spot loopholes that others didn't even notice. She was always one step ahead, like a spy who knows where the next attack will come. After her, Ben Foster joined, a quiet, calm programmer from Oregon who, despite his reserve, always found a solution where others were lost. And finally, James Reed, our strategist, possessed not only an analytical mind but also an amazing intuition. He could predict the development of events several steps before they began to unfold. All of them were so different, but together we formed a team that became the mainstay of our company, a core on which to rely. We rented a small office in the Union Market neighborhood of D.C., and every day when I walked there, the city itself seemed to fill me with energy, like a warm breeze. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and coffee, and I liked to think that my team and I were becoming part of this city, its pulse, its life. Later, we moved to a larger office in Austin, and there the city's energy seemed to perfectly align with what we were trying to build. But despite all the changes, I always returned to my little house with the red door, the place where my empire began. Here, among the old walls and quiet evenings, I felt at home, even though the figures in my bank accounts had long since become astronomical. Over time, offers from venture capital firms began to arrive. They called, wrote, invited me to dinners at restaurants, promising rapid growth, large teams, international expansion. They offered me money and opportunities, but every time I said no. I didn't need more than I already had. I loved that Haven Portal was mine, that I could hold it in my own hands, without interference, without anyone's approval. I built it not to sell, but to preserve. One early autumn morning, I was sitting in my office, papers scattered across my desk, writing something, when Oliver King, my accountant, walked in. He was the kind of person who was hard to impress, calm, reserved, always in a gray suit, with a leather notebook that he carried everywhere. But that day, his voice was a little different. He approached my desk and, adjusting his glasses, said, "Janice, do you know where you are right now?" I shook my head. For me, numbers were always in flux, contracts, renewals, expansions. I never stopped my life to truly grasp the scale of it all. And then he said slowly, "Your valuation." He said it like a man saying zeros one by one, stone by stone, and those words, those zeros, filled the room like the ringing of a church bell. "Your valuation is $50 billion. I leaned back in my chair and felt the world freeze around me for a moment. The numbers seemed absurd, almost ridiculous, detached from reality, but I looked at the papers, the bank accounts, the contracts signed and sealed, and it was true. This wasn't just success, it was something more. I was extraordinary. But still, sitting in my small house with the red door, I felt like nothing had changed. The neighbors still waved at me in the mornings, I still stopped at the corner store for coffee, and my family still thought I was wasting my life sitting at my laptop. Closing my computer, I stood up and walked down the creaky hallway. As I approached the door, my fingers lightly touched the cool brass handle. And at that moment I didn't want to tell my family what had happened. I knew their faces would change, but at that moment something inside me kept me from saying anything. Perhaps the time had not yet come. I smiled to myself. Let them think what they want, let them whisper their doubts. the truth will come, and when it does, it will crash like a storm. Until now, I'd kept the secret of my $50 billion, like everything else, quietly and without unnecessary fuss. The world continued to spin, life went on as usual, and only those few who knew of our success remained close. Meanwhile, amid this rapid growth and change, someone else was also moving forward, Jonathan Hale, step by step, as always, moving from congressman to senator, and then, it seemed, to something even greater. Until I lost track of his career, I had no idea how our paths would cross again, or how the friendship we had once built would one day change everything. And it happened at a family gathering I will never forget, in the house where I grew up, where I lived through my most difficult and most painful moments. Cleveland, Ohio, that's where I grew up, and it will always be home, no matter how far I travel. My parents' house stood on a wide street with perfectly manicured lawns and neighbors who loved to gossip on their front porches. Everything was just like it was in my childhood, but this house was larger than my current one in Washington, D.C., and it was louder, like the loud, bustling city where I was born. Its walls held the echoes of all the family celebrations, birthdays, holidays, arguments, and reconciliations, where there wasn't always room for me, but always room for their expectations. This house was the stage where my parents played the role of proud hosts, even if pride in me wasn't part of their plans. And so, in this house, one cool autumn day, my family decided to host a gathering for numerous relatives and friends, as often happens in such homes, where everyone tries to show off their best and create a semblance of happiness. The smell of fried chicken and lemon pie filled the living room, a strange combination that made the house feel joyful and alive, yet stifling, like I didn't belong. People chatted loudly in the corners, balancing paper plates of food and red cups of punch. I stood by the window, keeping a little to myself, a cup in my hand, as always, observing everyone, but remaining as inconspicuous as ever. My mother, Linda, swaggered around the room like the queen of the evening, wearing her finest pearl jewelry, as if the entire room had been created just for her. My father, Robert, stood next to her, chatting about nothing, laughing loudly at jokes, as always, oblivious to what was really going on in the family. My brother, Mark, basked in the attention, telling yet another made-up story about his career in sales, each one slightly more exaggerated than the last. My sister Emily, however, was silent, but her gaze, whenever it fell on me, remained wary, with a subtle disapproval that I had become accustomed to noticing and ignoring. At one point, when the conversation turned to careers and success, my mother waved her hand casually in my direction and, with a slightly mocking tone, said, "That stupid woman," she chuckled to the guests, "is always glued to her laptop and can't do anything else." My father, as always, agreed, nodding and laughing loudly, and Mark, not to be outdone, joined in the laughter. Emily was silent as usual, but strangely, she didn't defend me, she simply turned away, as if it didn't concern her. I stood to the side, silently sipping my punch, and although a storm raged in my chest, I remained calm. Over the years, I learned the art of silence, learned to be invisible, so as not to waste words on people who had already decided not to listen. It was my shield and my sword. But then, without warning, everything changed. Suddenly, the air in the room changed, the front door opened, and a gust of cool air blew into the house. Conversation stopped, and everyone's heads turned, as if something foreshadowed that something momentous was about to happen, and it was something that would stay with us forever, imprinted in the memory of everyone who was there. The first to enter were men in dark suits, members of the Secret Service, and their mere presence silenced everyone, as if the very atmosphere of the moment had frozen in the air. And then he walked through the doorway, Jonathan Hale, President of the United States, the same man I'd once helped fix his broken campaign website, the one who'd asked me questions about leadership late at night, the one who'd climbed the political ladder step by step, carrying the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. He wasn't there as a politician, not there to give a speech or shake hands. This wasn't happening the way we were used to. It was different. He was there as a friend, not as a politician, not as a president, but as the man we'd once talked with in the kitchen, sharing dreams and laughter, sharing moments when the world seemed simpler. In his hands was a small bouquet of white flowers, carefully tied with a gold ribbon, and a gold envelope, which he held with such respect, as if it were more than just paper. His face was warm, his smile genuine. When he spoke, His voice was even, familiar, almost like a family member, but there was a certain confidence in it that no one else in the room could match, and it silenced everyone. "Janice," he said calmly, as if he were talking about something mundane, "congratulations on reaching the $50 billion mark." It was so simple, so unpretentious, as if he were simply checking the clock, as if any of us could achieve this. He didn't offer praise or speak of great deeds, simply a fact, but a fact that changed everything, including my place in this house, among these people, and then, as if continuing his thought, he added, "Your platform ensures the safety of our hospital, the peace of our power plants, and the openness of our small towns for business. I came to say, thank you." The room, once noisy and crowded, now seemed frozen. My mother, who always led the conversation and ruled this house, couldn't keep her hand from moving, and Her Majesty slumped. My father, as loud and animated as ever, was left with his jaw slack, unsure how to close it. I could see his face suddenly go blank, as if he didn't understand what had just happened. Mark, who had always been so sure of himself, seemed to lose his footing, his confidence vanishing in an instant, like water spilling from a cracked glass. Even Emily, who usually hid her feelings, whispered my name under her breath, as if it were a new, unfamiliar word she'd never spoken before. Jonathan looked at my parents, and his eyes, which I knew so well, filled with that strange yet powerful mixture of respect and intimacy. He knew that speaking the truth in this house was like removing a knife from a wound. He knew he was in a place where nothing could be hidden. "Your daughter has been helping my team long before I took this position," he said. His voice was firm, with a touch of the confidence inherent in a president, but it also carried the intimacy of an old friend with whom he once shared moments when the world seemed simpler. I remembered how long I'd worked for him, how I'd never asked for recognition, how I'd never sought praise or gratitude. It wasn't necessary. I was simply doing my job, and I think that's what he wanted to emphasize. "She never asked for recognition, she never asked me for perfume, she simply did her job, and she did it better than anyone else." I remained silent, feeling no need to add anything, because his words required no confirmation. Everything had been said. Carefully, almost ceremoniously, he handed me the gold envelope. I held it in my hands, feeling my palm grow heavy. Inside was a single sheet of White House letterhead, on which were written 6 simple words, representing my work, the work that keeps America safe. Next to the note was a small, shiny pen engraved with the presidential seal. The weight of this envelope was significantly heavier than all the billions in my bank account. This wasn't money, this was recognition of my worth, a recognition that came from the highest official in the country, one I hadn't sought, but needed. And then, in that moment, holding that envelope in my hands, I realized that for the first time in my life, I no longer needed my family's approval. I didn't need their recognition, I no longer craved their words. I had outgrown it. That moment was liberating. Jonathan looked at me, and his gaze held everything I needed. He reminded me that the world beyond these walls already knew who I was. I didn't need to prove it to anyone in this room. His gaze told me I was free. The meeting continued, but not as before. Conversations faded to whispers, glances were directed my way, and every gesture from my family seemed strained, forced. My parents, Mark, Emily, they all became like alien figures in this game in which I no longer played. I remained by the window, in my favorite spot. But now I was no longer in shadow, I stood upright, in the light. The President of the United States had entered my parents' home to honor me. And that memory will never fade from the minds of those who were there. As the evening slowly wore on, the full significance of what was happening dawned on me. It was a turning point, a moment when my family's perception of me opened a crack so vast that no apology could fill it. They might have been shocked, perhaps they were ashamed, but for me, it was liberation. And despite everything I'd left behind, I knew one thing: I no longer needed them, and that was exactly what I'd always feared. The house that had once filled with their laughter was now filled with a silence, heavy and tugging like cotton wool, settling thickly over everything, suppressing every sound, every movement, and perhaps it was a silence of awe, though to me it seemed more ominous than I could have imagined. Was it disbelief? Or fear? I couldn't tell. But I couldn't help but feel every cell of my body fill with a strange sense of release. I placed the cup on the table with such intent, as if this simple act could somehow bring structure to the chaos raging within me. The paper sagged under the weight of the remaining liquid, as if the very memory of all those years wavered, ready to crumble. My mother's eyes were wide, looking at me as if she were seeing not her daughter for the first time, but someone completely alien, and my father's face had grown so pale it seemed he might collapse. He couldn't even hide his confusion. My brother's jaw was still hanging open, words were missing, but his gaze was filled with something I had long ago learned to recognize. It was the look of despair. Emily looked at me, and in her eyes I noticed a strange mixture of awe and regret, as if she finally realized that everything I'd said and done all those years was not an illusion, but a reality she had to face. The air in the room was thick with the words they'd just spoken, as if they were dispelling my long nights of doubt. "Stupid woman," echoed in my head, and the truth President Hale had revealed, something they might not have guessed, but which they all now felt. For years, I'd carried their accusations, their dismissal, their words that never went beyond this house. Those words had become an invisible chain, dragging me back into this world of alienation and discontent. But in that moment as I held the golden envelope, I felt lighter than ever before. I realized I'd outgrown them. I no longer needed their approval. It was liberation. "I told you I was working," I said quietly but calmly, in an even and good-natured voice, as if I had nothing to prove. "You chose not to believe me. It's not my burden." They tried to shout over each other, interrupting, apologizing, but their words were useless. My mother's voice wavered when she said she meant it, that she was only joking. Everything became clear as water, and the water in that cup couldn't go back to its place. My father insisted that deep down he had always been proud of me, and it sounded so false that I almost couldn't believe it. Mark, still stunned, mumbled something about not understanding what I'd been doing all these years. Emily finally whispered, "I'm sorry, Janice." These words, spoken with such effort, as if they were pouring all their sincerity into them, hung in the air like feathers, soft and weightless, without force. Too late to make sense. I heard them, but I didn't feel them. And then the memories came flooding back. My white brick house with the red door, once my refuge, my conviction, my fortress, a mug of coffee that never emptied but always remained full, like those endless nights I spent staring at my old laptop screen, when the world seemed so simple and clear, and only I knew how to move. I remembered my first subscription, sold for $49, and that $1 million transfer that terrified me, but I kept moving despite the fear. I remembered the carefully signed trust documents that hid my empire, its foundation, in plain sight, yet so discreet. Every memory was stronger than any words or apologies, and President Hale approached me, gently offering his hand, and his presence filled the room with a dignity that hadn't been there before. His words cut through the din of my family's remorse like the tip of a knife. "Janice," he said quietly, almost intimately, "let's go for a drive. I'd like to show you something about the White House." I looked at him, and that look was liberating. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to get out of there. I looked at my family and saw despair on their faces. They reached out to me, as if they could bring back those years of disbelief and doubt. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice didn't waver. It wasn't harsh, it was calm, clear, confident. There was no malice, no anger, only simple clarity. "I wish you all the best." They tried to hold me back, begged me to stay, but I didn't. I'd given them years of silence, and in return they'd filled me with doubt. It was a debt I couldn't repay. I left the living room, Jonathan following behind. We passed the stunned guests, parting like water before a boat, past polished furniture, photographs on the walls, and the lemon-scented sheen of surfaces my mother had so carefully scrubbed for this occasion. We walked down the hallway, and I felt everything in this house growing more and more alien. When I reached the door that had once held me in place, I didn't look back. This time, I was free. The cool evening air enveloped me like new skin as I stepped out the door. The motorcade was already waiting at the curb, the black cars gleamed under the streetlights, and the security guards moved with such precision they seemed part of the night. They opened the door for us, and I slipped inside. Jonathan followed. The leather seats smelled of cedar, and the hum of the engine was the promise of movement, the promise of a new journey. As the car pulled away, I looked out the window at the house. It grew smaller, the red door a small blur, the lights glowing like distant stars, and soon the entire building became just another silhouette in the neighborhood I once called home. I wasn't angry, I didn't even feel triumphant. That wasn't it. All I felt was clarity, a strange, unfamiliar gift that unexpectedly sharpened my perception, lifting the weight of melancholy and the sting of resentment. I suddenly realized that every step, every decision, had led me here, to this moment, and although I wasn't looking for justification or revenge, I no longer felt lost in the world that had once confined me. Returning to Washington became something deeply personal for me, like a homecoming after long wanderings. The white brick house with the red door that had sheltered me all these years, every corner of which held memories of my journey, both before and after. I walked into the house, and everything I felt was familiar: the creaking floorboards, the old but reliable humming refrigerator, the aroma of coffee grounds lingering in the kitchen, like a small, invisible link to the time when I started all this. I sat down at the table, where my trusty laptop waited for me. Like an old friend, as if it knew I would return, no matter how difficult it was, I opened it and immediately typed a short message to my team: "We did it, now let's do more." My fingers found the right keys on their own, and I finally felt calm and confident moving forward. When I opened my accounts, I saw endless rows of numbers that no longer frightened me. $50 billion. It was more than just wealth, it was power, responsibility, boundless opportunity, and while I wasn't looking for fame, I knew I could do something meaningful with it. I thought about the people who once reminded me of them: girls coding at their kitchen tables, women tallying their bills, dreaming of a better future, schools needing new computers, libraries begging for help, scholarships for women striving to make their mark in the tech world. I took the first step. I transferred $150 million to the foundation I'd created in the shadows of my empire, and now it's a reality. The money has gone to schools in Detroit and New Orleans, to supporting public libraries in small Midwestern towns, to scholarships for women in tech. I named it Haven Foundation, after the Haven portal platform that made it all possible, and the moment I made that transfer, I felt something powerful, almost sacred. Money was being transformed into the future, and this wasn't just an act of charity. It was my decision to leave a mark, and the weight of that decision, that sense of responsibility, filled me with a greater pride than any contract I'd ever signed. Despite the magnitude of my achievements, I continued to live my ordinary life. I didn't buy a mansion or a private jet. I didn't start wearing jewelry or driving luxury cars. I continued my evening strolls through the quiet streets of Washington, not really considering that I could live differently. My neighbors often waved at me, and I nodded back, revealing no secrets about who I really was. None of them guessed what a vast empire I carried on my shoulders. Sometimes I thought about Europe, about those clients from London who paid me in pounds, about short trips to close deals, but thoughts of home, of my place, of the people who would one day benefit from everything I had done, always returned. My heart remained here, in America. It was in the hum of my laptop, in the red door of my house, in these people who could find their future through the changes I could make. People often ask me what changed after that day in Cleveland when President Hale walked into my parents' house and shattered every illusion they'd built around me. My answer is simple: inside, nothing changed. I'd always been that woman, a creator, a dreamer, a protector. The rest of the world simply picked me up, and I went along with it. As for my family, I left them behind forever, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. You can't take a storm with you once you've ridden it. You move on, calm and confident, sure of your path. They made their choice when they fired me. I achieved mine when I decided to leave. That evening, when I closed my laptop, looking around my small but cozy home was a turning point. I realized something profound and important: freedom doesn't come with money. Money helps, of course, but it doesn't bring freedom. Freedom comes with clarity, with understanding who you are, what you've accomplished, and what you can no longer accept. And I, Janice Carter, was free.